You are no longer at the gates, you are no longer out in the cold, you are inside council. But what does that mean and how does it affect you? Welcome to the show. My name is Roscoe Palm. Joining me today, I've got Kaden Arguile, who is the National Youth Chairperson of the Good Party. How are you doing, Kaden?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, Roscoe.
Cool. And Arguile Notywala, who is a councillor for the Good Party in the city of Cape Town, and a victim of grievous mispronouncing of his name by the Speaker of the House, Speaker of Council, Felicity Purchase. How does one pronounce your name?
She can just call me Axe.
Axe, just call you Axe.
That's what the Speaker should just say.
He's a Councillor Axe. So today we're going to be talking about a few issues. National Youth Chairperson of the Good Party, Kaden Arguile, has been sounding the alarm on water pollution in the city of Cape Town, what this could mean for our environment and public health. So Kaden, tell me what's happening with our water and what motivated you to come out all guns blazing against our beautiful beaches?
Well, Roscoe, I think to set the stage, we have to look at the resource of water on the African continent. This is something that is a scarcity and is something that is a finite resource, and that experts throughout the world is predicting going to be one of the most key resources in the next 100 years. Oh. So our water quality is something that is of utmost quality, well, utmost importance, I should say. And on top of that, that obviously extends into our seawater, not just drinking water as well, because with our seawater comes obviously fishing, with our seawater comes our environment and obviously our biodiversity. Now, in the Cape Town, Western Cape specifically, we got to also remember that this is a province that not too many years ago suffered one of the worst droughts in all of South African history, to the point where people were stockpiling, to the point where there were serious concerns about a day zero. And with that in mind, it only shows that this province in particular has not only a critical ability to basically tip over into a crisis mode when it comes to drought potential, but on top of that, that if there is not correct decisions made in this province, there's potentially thousands of lives and thousands of businesses and thousands of families that will completely be lost or disrupted through the loss of water. Now, where this statement comes from specifically is this new minister, the DA Minister Dion George, who basically completely backtracked on his predecessor Barbara Creesy's decision, in which when we distribute sewage, it obviously gets pumped out into the water. Some areas are different, and we'll touch on that later, the differences between eThekwini and Western Cape specifically. But when it comes to Cape Town specifically, in almost all of our branches, we pump this, for better lack of words, sewage straight into the ocean. And what this means is that this filtration that is happening is very light, because we are not mass producing chemicals, we are not mass producing any specific function, we're simply filtering this water and letting it go out. And obviously, it doesn't take a rocket science to understand that you cannot be pumping sewage, basically raw human excrement, into the ocean without there being consequences. So before leaving office, Barbara Creesy stated that there is no environmental benefit or no environmental justification for the sewage pumping, especially were it to be raised. Fast forward to where we're at now. And without public participation, without any due process, and coming from a minister who, in his own words, does not even know what COP is in an environmental standpoint, he has decided to basically raise these limits far past anything else before, which basically means that so many of our beaches, which were already, some of them, such as Greenpoint, such as Camps Bay, areas that have already seen discharge levels that are concerning, are now only going to become worse because of capacity. And that is a failure to plan, in my opinion.
So you also say that there's no public consultation and a general lack of knowledge given to ordinary citizens of Cape Town as to what's happening. So in your view, what kind of public engagement should be taking place between the city and the residents about this effluent being dumped into our oceans?
Yeah, I mean, I think 100% the public participation process is so vital when it's coming to something like this. Because if you look at this, as I said, it's not a singular issue. This is not a singular event. If we had to look back to 2024 at the beginning of the year, you have various principled and very accomplished individuals who are coming out against the city of Cape Town, basically saying that the levels that we are getting displayed are not accurate. And the testing is also not as thorough as it could be, because a lot of people think, oh, these water treatment plants, they're testing for everything. They're testing for, obviously your E. coli and stuff like that. But what about chemicals? What about things that are harmful? No. We only test for two things, and one of those being E. coli and another of those being also another strain that comes from human excrement. So what that means is that all of these variety of different factors that could be, having an impact on, such as algae growth, such as fish development, such as, just a biodiversity, let alone what the impact could be on humans, all of this is slowly starting to build up. And because it's underneath the surface, we are failing to what the human condition is very prone to, where if I can't see the problem, it's not real. And if you have to look at this public participation process, over this last year, we've really seen multiple different experts, Stellenbosch researchers, people from the National Sea Rescue Institute, former CEOs, all of them basically coming out against the city and saying, your public participation process is basically non-existent when it comes to water. You are basically saying deny. And on top of that, there's no actual understanding that the system needs to be upgraded. And the fact that capacity can be used, and to say, well, the city's full, we couldn't account for this many tourists. That's just absolute nonsense. How can we be saying that if there's slightly more people in a city, suddenly we're just going to raise the amount of sewage that can come in? And that exact kind of decision making, and it being snapshot, and once again, by an individual who, in his own words, is not an expert in environmental affairs, yet he is leading our environmental affairs in the country, is making this decision. And it doesn't take a stranger to see that obviously the party that he's assigned with here is obviously the one that the city of Cape Town is being run by. So we have some very serious questions about how this decision was made and why none of these experts' concerns were noted at all.
So your statement also says it concludes with a challenge to the Minister and Mayor Jordan Hill-Lewis to take a dip in the water. Why would you want to do that to us? Why would you want to visit on us the horror of seeing, like Jordan Hill-Lewis and Dion George, splashing about in the water? But the serious question is, what actions should the city take to ensure that the marine waters are safe? What guarantee should the city give to people that, they're not swimming in effluent every time they go and take a dip?
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously there's hotspots that are in certain areas. We're not by any means claiming that every single water facility in the city is, or every single beach is contaminated, make that very clear. But at the same time, the kind of questions that you're asking is very important, because the kind of warnings that we've had are things that are so trivial, like don't swim 150 meters within the Greenpoint landfall, the effluent. And for me, I find that so ridiculous, because obviously the thought that water stays in one area, the thought that sewage or anything, sediment or anything, can only be distributed in an area in the ocean is absolutely unscientific, because obviously that's going to be flowing out into various areas. So I think one of the biggest things that they could do specifically is engage with these experts, these people who are leading water research institutes or leading lectures at UCT or Stellenbosch, or have 40 years of experience on the ocean themselves, such as the National Research. Get these people at the table and see why there's continuously so many people coming out against your water supply. If you claim that your beaches are this top-notch quality, even though many people are disputing that over the last years, if you claim it, work with these scientists to completely disprove it, because there's been more and more tests that have come up that is continuously getting challenged by the city. And at this point, it's just diverting us from the actual issue at hand, which is the fact that there are beaches and areas such as Soetermeer that have been obviously condemned. And for the people in those areas, that is basically taking away that environment and saying that it's beyond salvageable. And we've already seen this happen not once but twice in the city. So with this mindset, we can assume that this is a trend, that if something does go wrong, We'd rather stick our heads in the sand, put big X's around it and say, that's tough. And we've seen that it happen throughout Cape Town in various areas, in sewerage, when it comes to rubbish, when it comes to, housing. If there's an issue here and it's beyond repair, well, let's stick our head in the sand and let's not talk about it. We need to have proper justification that the stats and the claims that the city is making is true. And with that, there will be less drama that they've had. And we wouldn't have incidents like this blue report now that is obviously being challenged by the city and lawyers being potentially involved from both sides, and whether this is accredited or not. Because there's clearly experts who are passionate about water in the city, that care about the safety and clearly see something wrong. So we should listen to that.
Kaden, Arguile, thank you so much. The Constitutional Court has recently made a ruling that affects the fight for housing in the inner city. Joining me, I've got Axolile Notywala, a council for the Good Party and the provincial convener of Rise Mzansi. So, Axolile, can you give me a brief history of Woodstock Hospital, known as Sissy Cool House, and also AKH, Ahmed Kathrada House?
Sure. Thank you. So, just to say first, this year, 2025, will mark 75 years since the Group Areas Act, and that's very important in this context. And it's also very important for people to understand that Cape Town has been governed by the Democratic Alliance for 19 years now, and that's important in this context. So Sissy Cool House, CGH, is a hospital building. It's a former hospital building, similar to AKH, and these are buildings that have stood vacant for years. And I think it was probably in 2008 when there was a commitment for CGH to be developed into social housing. And we are here now, and nothing has happened. And because of that, and because of the struggle for land and housing and social housing and affordable housing in the inner city and surrounds, people chose to occupy that building and made homes. And it's not out of fun. And it's not out of fun because many of the people that live in CGH are people that have lived in Woodstock for all their lives. But because of the policy, which is driven again by the current governing party, of gentrification, people have been kicked out of their homes because they can no longer afford. And so they became homeless and they chose to occupy Sissy Cool House, which is in Woodstock, and AKH, Ahmed Kathrada House, which is in Sea Point. But also these two buildings, the Sissy Cool House is under the local government, which is the city of Cape Town. And that's important for the speaker to know as well, because in the last council meeting, the speaker says, we don't even own this building. I mean, how can you be the one that's directing council and you don't know what's happening in council? And that's important. AKH is under the provincial government, but both have not been developed. And so the history of them is through frustration, homelessness, and people being evicted for a number of years. They chose to say there are buildings, there is land, there is space. Let's build our own homes because the government is failing.
Right, so these are residents mainly of Woodstock area, and I think that has an implication for the Constitutional Court ruling. Yeah. So in a nutshell, what did the Constitutional Court rule that affects the inhabitants of AKH and CGH?
So again, essentially, in short, and I'll explain, the Concord said, stop your apartheid mentality. Because what happened there is that a company bought blocks of homes which were occupied by people. Again, people who had lived in those homes for all their lives. And the company bought those homes and wanted to evict those people. When an eviction process happens, whether it's private or public, whether it's the government, whether it's a private individual that evicts, the government has to step in because the government has a responsibility to provide alternative accommodation. So when that eviction process was happening, the city was called in the court process, and the city wanted to give those families alternative accommodation 15 kilometers away from where they live. And that's been the policy of the city. Evict people, take them to Blikkistop, which is 30 kilometers away from the city center. Evict people, take them to Philippi, one of the most dangerous townships in South Africa. And that disrupts people's homes, it disrupts people's families, it disrupts people's livelihoods. Because those people work in Woodstock, worked in the city center, their children go to school in these communities, and the city continues to implement this Group Areas Act policy that had existed for 75 years. And so the Constitutional Court simply said that, firstly, your emergency housing program, because when people are being evicted, you can use the emergency housing program to house them, is unconstitutional, because when you want to house them alternatively, you house them 15 kilometers away or 30 kilometers away. And so the Constitutional Court said, find a reasonable place within this surrounding where they have been living, so that they can continue their lives, so that their lives are not disrupted.
In the last council meeting, the Mayor of Cape Town, Jordan Lewis, you asked the mayor, why is this not developed? I think James Voss started the fire, and then Jordan Lewis then came in.
Yeah.
And he said that the reason why Woodstock Hospital is not developed, it's because you invaded the land.
Yeah.
So, Ax, why did you invade the land? Why did you personally, according to the mayor, invade the land and stop this development that Jordan Lewis was planning to do probably the very next day?
So I've been to CGH because there are people who live there, and there are activists and there are comrades who live there. I've seen them, I meet with them, I engage with them. But when the occupation, and that's also important, because the language that sometimes politicians use is language that easily criminalizes people. The language to invade is not even in our legislation. So when you talk about evictions and homes, the PI Act, the only time when it talks about illegality is when it speaks to the actions of government, not to the actions of the occupiers. Because the PI Act is called the Prevention of Illegal Eviction. And evictions are conducted mostly by government and private individuals who evict people. So the illegality is normally as an action of government. The prevention of illegal eviction and unlawful occupation. So unlawful occupation refers to the people that occupy land. And so you can sense that language, that the illegality is normally, it can be a criminal act by the government, but the unlawfulness of it, it's not a criminal act. And that's recognized in the Constitution. So firstly, no one ever invaded land in the current context of CGH. If you talk about land invasion, think about 1652. But in the current context of South African's democracy, no one invades land. People occupy land so that they can build homes. I never occupied CGH. I know the comrades who occupied CGH. I've been involved in many cases where I have been there to protect people who are being illegally evicted, to tell them about the law, what they need to do to protect themselves. But I've never invaded or occupied any space. But I have always been there to be with the people that are trying to build homes for themselves. Jordan Lewis, I don't think he's been to CGH. Probably even Carl Popheim, who is the MACO member for Human Settlement, during this so-called public participation process, he promised that he was going to go and engage with the residents there. He's not been there. And this process ends at the end of this month. And it tells you how they view those people. They don't view probably about 900 people that are living there, families, children, mothers, grandmothers. They don't view them as people who belong in Cape Town. They view them as criminals. Hence, they don't go to engage with them.
What needs to happen with the site now? Well, not only CGH, AKH, but all land in the inner city.
Develop homes, develop affordable housing, develop social housing, and make sure that people are housed, and stop the continuous eviction of people to the outskirts of the city. The city the city, the parts of the city that works, they work because of domestic workers, they work because of cleaners, they work because of security people. All these people, they are not seen as people that belong. They only seen for their labor. And that's what we're saying must stop. If these people keep this city working, they must live in the city. They must enjoy. They must enjoy the mountains. They must enjoy the beaches, because currently, because of, again, a non-existent public transport system, these people spend almost half of their salary to try and keep the CBD clean for people who, some of them, don't live here. The digital nomads that come and spend monies in Cape Town and continues this policy of gentrification. So all we're saying is Woodstock Hospital is a building, it's easy to develop it. Stop the sale of land without making sure that if you do sell the land, make sure that whoever you sell the land to will develop affordable housing, social housing, inclusionary housing, so that you can have the mixed type of development, so that you can start bringing people together, those who are of certain different classes, those who are of different races. People need to start living together. And we have an opportunity with CGH, with AKH, and many other buildings that stand vacant within the city center.
Councillor Notywala, thank you so much. So, Ax, there's a lot of confusion about different types of housing. So can you briefly explain to me the difference between social housing, transitionary housing, CRU, and inclusionary housing?
Sure. So some of these housing types, you have essentially two types. I'll get to the ones that you've mentioned. But in broad, you have housing that can be for ownership. And then you have housing that can be for rental, which is what is known as rental stock. Social housing, affordable housing encompasses all of them. The word affordable means that people have to afford the places in which they have to live. So social housing is a housing development that would be developed by the local government. They get grants and money from provincial and national government to develop affordable social housing for people who earn between around 1,800 rands up until 22,000 rands. So those people, and it's normally rental housing. So those people, with the amount of salaries that they earn, they can afford to rent in social housing. So that's social housing. Transitional housing comes into effect in the context of a case such as Bromwell, where people are being evicted. So when you can no longer afford, if you lose your job or something happens to you and you can no longer afford, transitional housing, as the name says, is transitional. It's not permanent. You get a space while you're trying to rebuild your life. Once you are in a state where you can rebuild your life, then you can then move, and then someone else comes in. So it deals with issues of homelessness and people that are in the streets that can be accommodated while they try to rebuild their lives. Then there's inclusionary housing, which is also very important in the context of an apartheid city, in the context of the legacy of apartheid in the city and in the country. Inclusionary housing is where, in some of these high-cost development, where you say, if you are, this as the city normally does, if you are selling land to a private developer, if you have an inclusionary housing policy, it says that a percentage of your development must be affordable. You can have those apartments that cost 45,000 rands a month, 100,000 rands a month, in the same building where someone who earns between 1,800 rands and 22,000 rands can live with you. And so it brings people together. It brings the classes that I was talking about together, the different racial groups together. And so that's what inclusionary housing is. And community residential units are what can also be, in the current context, referred to as hostels. So these are some of the housing development that you found mostly in townships. Again, people rent in these spaces. It's community residential units. People rent in these spaces. Again, earning between those amounts, 1,800 rands and 22,000 rands.
Cool. Breaking news, gang violence is not out of control. That's according to Western Cape MEC for Community Safety, Andrew Murray. With me to discuss this is Arguile Notywala and Kaden Arguile. Let me start with you, Kaden. You released a statement on the state of gang violence in the Western Cape. Broadly speaking, what did you say?
Thanks, Roscoe. Broadly speaking, I mainly focused on two things specifically. One, on the recent tragic case of the 5-year-old boy who was shot on the way to the tuck shop in an absolutely tragic instance of gang violence within Manenberg. And then I specifically spoke about, obviously, the Western Cape Safety Plan and how the stats have shown that over the years, this is not something that's being solved, but instead, once again, something that's being pushed to the side or having band-aids put over an open wound, if one could say. And I think specifically we have to look at the fact that 1 year prior to this incident, residents throughout all of Manenberg specifically walked through the streets protesting gang violence, talking about how this culture of violence being one of these top 10 most dangerous areas in all of the country, municipalities. This is something that was unacceptable and exactly almost sad, but a sad poetic instance that a year later this happens, and then 5 days after that, an 18-year-old girl is shot in Delft on the way to a tuck shop by gang members. And I think specifically what we needed to highlight in this sentence is that while many people would like to think that everything is fine and everything is dandy, it's not fine, it's not dandy, it's just in the areas that you are in that it's okay, that gang violence is out of control. And when you're not seeing it every single day, when it's not part of your entire culture, when it's not part of the safety about impacting education, your business, etc., it's very easy to say it's not out of control. But to the communities that are living in a constant fear, and in an instance where you can't even go out and buy groceries, in this case, or buy a sweet, or anything like that, because your life might be at risk, whether you be 5 or whether you be 18, this is a culture for the youth, and it's a culture of violence that has been allowed to permeate by this Western Cape government.
In the Western Cape, and Ax, I want to bring you in here, the latest South African Police Services crime statistics, nationwide 221 gang-related murders between July and September 2024, 177 were in the Western Cape. What is it about this particular province that breeds this dysfunction?
So I think it's important. I think part of the problem with how these things are seen is that they're just a policing issue. Crime is a policing issue, but safety is not just a policing issue. It speaks to the underdevelopment, it speaks to the unemployment, it speaks to the level of poverty and inequality in a city and province, cities such as Cape Town and province such as the Western Cape. So if you don't deal with those things, you can send 1 million police into these communities. You will never deal with gang violence and violent crime in particular. And so committing resources into making sure that there is development, committing resources into making sure that every child is at school. And instead, what the Western Cape provincial government under Alan Winde did is to take money away that would have gone to education to make sure that young kids in black and colored communities are not easily attracted to gangs because they are restless. If you are in school, amount of time takes you away from being co-opted into gangs. And we need to look into these issues in that broad sense. That means development at the city level, that means sports, recreation, all these facilities that you can find in many other parts of the city, but you don't find in townships such as Manenberg and many others. That's the type of investment that is needed in those communities. We also have a drug pandemic, and that having a reactionary police unit, which is law enforcement, is not going to be able to deal with that. And that's where you need crime intelligence, but also you need to have rehabilitation spaces for these young people so that they can be taken care of, so that they can not be involved heavily in drug abuse as they are, because that's what gets them into gangs. That's what makes them feel easy for them to pull the trigger to kill. And so if you don't deal with those underlying issues, you won't be able to deal with the issue of violent crime in Cape Town and the Western Cape.
One of the solutions that you are implementing, in fact, is to use sport as a tool to bring people together. Can you briefly tell me about that and what your theory of the case is and how that can deter people away from crime and from gangs and criminal behavior?
So we're at a place where it becomes easier now for a young person to access a gun than it is to access a soccer ball. And that's the context in which we live. And part of the work that we do through sport with the soccer team called Role Models FC is how do we develop positive role models in our communities. And it's not just soccer. It cannot just be soccer, because there's many talents that young people have. We have a cricket stadium in Khayelitsha that's underutilized because there are no proper resources. There's no people who go there and get people interested in cricket. So making sure that children are in school. After that, they can go and practice sport, so that you remove that restlessness that gets them easily co-opted. But you also teach them and develop them, because it's not just taking them away from crime, it's also developing them the skill that they have, so that one day they can play for the national team.
That would be amazing if one of your kids becomes a professional. It would be amazing.
It will happen.
Right. So, Kaden, you are the National Youth Chairperson of Good, and now just with the release of matric results, speaking about these environments where violence is just part and parcel of daily life, even though Andrew Murray says there is no crisis here. What are the prospects that are faced by these kids that come from these areas, and how can we fix it long term? Obviously, there's no quick fixes, but how do you see a strategy where red zones become green?
Well, I think literally what you're touching on there with the red zones is something where I would love to start in, because I think that already kind of, in my opinion, as someone who hasn't lived in, and to any listeners right now, this is the 4th province I'm living in. I've only lived in Western Cape for 2 years. So that does give me a bit of a unique outside perspective, especially with what's considered normal here and what's not considered normal. And for me, the whole process of a red zone immediately implies that we are in a crisis. It immediately implies that we are too far gone. Because
explain what a red zone is.
A red zone, to any listener, is basically the Western Cape government decides that some areas are too high violence to basically send in ambulances, medical teams, because they themselves could be attacked, their vehicles could be robbed, their chemicals in there could be stolen, etc. And is that not already an admission of failure? The fact that we are saying we need more police, we need more guns, but we don't have the police to escort an ambulance. The case that we just spoke about with the 5-year-old child who was shot. Imagine if there were more medical facilities in the area, there were more upliftment that Axe was so perfectly talking about, and how if we had that community together, there would also be potentially more people with, ability to help, or more ability to actually protest that and try and challenge the outcome, or wanting to get involved with changing these things. And I think that's the biggest thing, is that, Axe was talking about football. It's about trauma. This culture of gang violence is generational trauma, whether it be your third cousin getting shot or your second cousin dying of drugs, a father, whatever it is. Communities that are so tightly packed together because of the Social Housing and the Group Areas Act means that these communities are interconnected. They all feel what each other feel. When a child is lost, that entire community is in mourning. And we're talking about, obviously, drug rehabilitation centers, but, trauma counseling, all of these kind of things are all so necessary, because as we've seen from these matric results, the youth of this future is not only the future being bright, but on top of that, they are willing to go through all of this, obviously uphills when it comes to Eskom load shedding, when it comes to the communities at the end, when it comes to their future job prospects. I mean, statement that I'll be releasing later today is talking about how medicine, which is seen as the prized place to go academically, is still not good enough to get a job in this country. So when we look at all these factors, whether it be obviously generational trauma, whether it be the red zones and the lack of medical assistance, whether it be the lack of economic opportunities, the drug epidemic, the housing epidemic, it all culminates into this culture of hopelessness. And when there is no hope, there is no desire to do better. There is no desire to be kind or curious to your fellow man. It's the desire to survive. And this is the dystopian gang culture that I have come and seen in this province. And I truly believe that if we are to look at the youth in the eyes and say that these drones and these shot spotters and these virtual policing simulators are the ways that your community is going to be changed, then we're basically saying to the children that there is no future of peace. There's a future of guns, just gangsters' guns or police guns. And I truly believe that's not the way forward. The way forward is through conversations, through rehabilitation, through upliftment. And that is the way that a culture changes. That is the way that a society changes.
Last question to both of you. I'll start with you, Ax. Why do you think Andrew Murray, the MEC for community safety, what motivates her to say something that's just simply not true?
She's out of touch, like many other politicians that she serves with. It's something that doesn't affect her personally and her family and her community. And so it doesn't seem like a reality, but also she's a politician that lies, because that's the trend now. That if you can't be able to deal with a developmental issue, the only way where you try to defend yourself is to lie, and that's what politicians these days do, and it's sad and it's frustrating, and it angers a lot of people, such as the lie that Helen Zille made to say the city does more for Khayelitsha than it does for Camps Bay.
Let's talk about that. I saw this on Twitter. I'm glad you brought it up. So Helen Zille said that the city does more for residents in Khayelitsha than it does for residents in Camps Bay.
And she also said as well, can I just say, that you can go into Khayelitsha anywhere and turn on a tap and it will work as well. And I'm just thinking, like, how absolutely delirious do you have to be to believe that not only is there consistent water supply, but every single tap would, like, just that, isn't that just the hyperbole? It's just...
It's like, you spoke about Notywala Mafevoga. It's 9 years later now. Mm-hmm. There's no young girl that has died in a communal toilet, that was raped and murdered in a communal toilet in Camps Bay. There are no kids that have died because refuse collection has not been consistent in Camps Bay. That has happened in Khayelitsha. There has been no children who have died because of gang violence, because of extortion, because of many of these issues in Camps Bay. That has happened in Khayelitsha. There's no children in Camps Bay who go to bed hungry, who resort to crime because their parents don't have money. But that happens in Khayelitsha. And so this is what we're starting to see now, firstly with Jordan Hill Lewis lying about me, when they don't have the facts to back up their failures, they attack, they lie. That's what Jordan Hill Lewis did, that's what Helen Zille did, that's what Andre Murray did. And so you're starting to see this trend of these leaders in the province and in the city of just being politicians that lie, and something that they continually point out to the ANC is something that they do now on a daily basis.
Can I just touch as well? I think in that exact where you're taking that quote from, I saw the rest of the statement as well, and I think what struck me was obviously her saying that and then immediately following up with basically how she's been desensitized to the pools of blood that you'd find, the amount of these scenes that you'd walk into. And I think, once again, like for anyone who enjoys English at home, that is a juxtaposition. It's basically saying, here's one thing and here's the exact opposite right after that. And that's what a lot of politicians do, and that's why the English language is so important when it comes to this, and language in general, I think, is because public perception matters. And for them to go out and say, there's gang culture and gang violence and there's all of these different things and we're going to nip this in the bud, it's an admission of failure. And as we've just stated, they've sunk so much investment publicly going on record and saying that they've diverted funds from education and health to combat these things. And let's look, we haven't even really touched on the stats yet. Like, the stats are damning. There is one or two instances where there's a downwards tick in murder by a couple in the last 3 years, but let's go through all of them. Let's go through contact crime, let's go through assault, let's go through kidnappings, let's go through obviously the gang statistics that you spoke, murder in general. All of these things, they are all continuously increasing, except for maybe a 3-month dip in murder in the middle of last year at a point. And with that in mind, how can we be saying we're going to take away these developmental aspects that Axe highlighted that are so key to a community and instead put them in the guns, which is already the wrong decision. But now we're going to fail at that and we're going to say that there's no problem. And, the thing I find the most ridiculous is that we have 9 provinces in this country. And with that in mind, we have literally have 5 of the top 10 most dangerous precincts, not just in one category, in almost all of the categories that I mentioned, GBV as well, all of them, all in the Western Cape.
In the city of Cape Town.
In the city of Cape Town, yeah. So not even the Western Cape, city of Cape Town. And that is something that is, for a city that claims to be the best in the world, how could you ever say that when consistently you have 5 precincts that are always in the top 10?
Well, there you have it. There is no crisis. Everything's good, according to Andre Marais. And we live in the best run, most beautiful, amazing province in the world, where all the taps can be opened in Kailitra and nothing bad will ever happen on the Cape Flats. Thanks for joining us. Thank you, Kaden. Thank you so much for your impassioned, articulate theory of the case.
Too kind.
And thank you, Councillor Arguile Notywala. I still don't believe that you can invade all that land. How can the mayor can't lie? Come on, he's the mayor. He wears that big red bathrobe and a big gold chain. Unimpeachable character.
Thank you for the time.
Thanks for joining us. Catch Inside Council next time. I'm Roscoe Palm. Thank you to Cape Conscious Media Studios. Cape Conscious Media is politically unaffiliated, and it is a community project that seeks to uplift the youth of the Cape Flats. Till next time, thank you very much.